children are a nuisance, so go to a facility. I don't have a mother anymore. My name is Elaine Gray. I'm still in the 5th grade of elementary school, and I live with my father and mother in a family of 3. My father is very warm and often takes me out on holidays. My mother acts normal when my father is around, but when he's not, she can be cold and hard to approach. I'm off. As usual, my father headed to work early in the morning. While eating breakfast, I called out, "Take care." Looking at the clock, it was almost time to go to school. I hurried to finish my breakfast and rushed to change my clothes. Thank you for the meal. After finishing, I put the dishes in the sink and headed back to my room to change. Just a moment. My mother called me back, and when I turned around, she was pointing at the sink. Who is going to wash these? Her eyes were stern, and she seemed angry. Normally, I would just change and go to school, but I felt like I would be scolded if I did that. I'll wash them myself. When I said this in a small voice, my mother suddenly yelled, "What? I can't hear you." My body jolted. However, feeling that I was wrong, I apologized. "I'm sorry. I'll wash them myself." Hoon. That's right. From now on, take care of your own things. With anger, my mother threw her apron onto the sofa and went back to her room. Reflecting on her words, I realized that I need to manage things myself, so I cleaned up after breakfast and left the house. While talking with friends at school, the topic of parents came up. Listening to them, their mothers seem kind, and although they sometimes get angry, their relationships appear good. "What's your mom like, Elaine?" I was suddenly asked, and I hesitated on how to respond. However, I thought that maybe my perception of my mother being cold was a misunderstanding and that she was irritable because I had been neglecting my responsibilities, so I answered that she is very kind. My friends responded with, "That's nice, but I felt conflicted." When I got home and said, "I'm back," there was no sign of my mother. Thinking she might have gone shopping, I started my homework in my room. Before I knew it, it was completely dark outside, and the clock indicated it was dinner time, but my mother still hadn't returned. After a while, I heard noises at the entrance and sounds of something being moved and the fridge opening. When I peeked into the kitchen from my room's door, I saw my mother. Feeling hungry, I approached the kitchen and greeted her with, "Welcome back." "I'm back." From her brief reply without turning around, I could tell she was still in a bad mood. "What's for dinner tonight?" I asked with a smile, but it seemed to be a mistake. My mother turned around with a frightening expression. "What? Didn't I tell you to take care of your own things?" Your dad will be home soon, and I'm busy preparing dinner." Unable to say anything more, I reluctantly started to make instant noodles just as my father came home. "I'm home." Hearing my father's voice, my mother immediately took the instant noodles I was holding. While I was disoriented by her actions, my father entered the kitchen. "Oh, are we just starting dinner now?" Seeing my gentle father's face, I felt tears welling up. "Welcome back." "Today, shopping took a bit long, so I'm about to start making dinner now. Daddy and Elaine, please wait a little longer." My mother's face softened. I wasn't sure if she was no longer angry, but the thought of eating the meal she was preparing made me feel happy. Later, we had dinner as a family and had a fun time playing games with my father. Maybe my mother was still a bit in a bad mood. As I fell asleep, I thought that if I properly took care of my own things, I wouldn't get scolded anymore. From the next day, I made an effort to manage my own affairs. I washed the dishes after breakfast, folded the laundry myself, and put it away in the closet. I cleaned my room, and on days when my mother was late, I prepared and ate instant noodles by myself. Hoping for a compliment from my mother, my face naturally brightened. Although she hasn't praised me yet, she has been getting angry less often. It's enjoyable to spend happy times with my father and the three of us as a family when he is home. One night, I woke up to groaning sounds and realized it was the middle of the night. Feeling scared and thinking it might be a ghost, I covered myself with my blanket. The groaning continued, and soon, trembling with fear, I heard the sound of an ambulance siren. The ambulance stopped very close to our house, and the front of the house became noisy. For the first time, I realized an ambulance had stopped in front of our house. I jumped out of bed in a panic and saw that it was my father being carried out by the paramedics. "Daddy," I cried out, seeing his face pale and in pain. Tears overflowing, I clung to a paramedic and pleaded, "Please save my dad." The paramedic gently placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "We'll take him to the hospital right away." Afterward, my mother and I followed in the ambulance to the hospital, and upon arrival, my father was quickly taken to the treatment room. All we could do was wait in the designated area. As we waited, anxiety dominated my mind, wondering what I would do if my father were to pass away. Next to me, my mother calmly operated her smartphone, showing no outward signs of worry. While shedding tears, I anxiously waited for someone to reassure me that everything would be all right. It's unclear how much time passed, but eventually, a doctor came to us. While my mother and the doctor discussed something complex, all I could understand was that a serious illness had been discovered in my father, and he would need to stay in the hospital for a while. Though the worst-case scenario might have been avoided, the fact that my father had to fight this illness pained my heart. I also had to accept the reality that he wouldn't be able to come home for some time. We decided to go home for the time being. My mother quickly prepared everything needed for my father's hospital stay and headed back to the hospital. Left alone at home, I lay in bed unable to sleep, and since I had come home early in the morning, it soon started to get light outside. I need to go to school. I knew I had to go to school, but my heart wasn't in it at all. I had no appetite and just lay still in bed. "Aren't you going to school?" It was noon by the time my mother noticed I hadn't gone. Although my mother didn't scold me for skipping school, she needed to visit the hospital and hurriedly left the house. Having not eaten anything since the morning, I headed to the kitchen. There was some rice left in the rice cooker and some leftovers from the previous night's dinner in the fridge, so I made a meal using those. In the evening, when my mother returned home, she had bought some sandwiches for me. Eat this today. Also, I bought some instant noodles, so have those from tomorrow. Okay, thank you. With my mother busy due to my father's situation, I decided to follow her instructions to not cause her any trouble. The next morning, I had instant noodles for breakfast and went to school. When my friends asked why I was absent the day before, I dodged the question by saying I was feeling unwell. The teacher seemed to understand my situation and spoke kindly to me. When I got home, my mother was not there, probably at the hospital with my father. Thinking about it, I started on my homework. I wanted to visit my father too, and planned to ask my mother if we could go together on the next holiday. While I was doing my homework, the phone rang, and since no one else was home, I decided to answer it. "Hello." "Ah, Elaine, is that you? What are you doing?" It was my father on the other end, and hearing his voice made tears spill over. "Dad. Are you okay? I want to see you." As I cried, my father spoke kindly and with a smile in his voice. "I'm sorry for worrying you. There's no problem now. Dad wants to see you. I'd like you and Mom to come visit." Yeah. I'll talk to Mom about it." "That's good. Is Mom there with you?" I was a bit puzzled by my father's question. Mom wasn't at home, and I thought she might be at the hospital. "Mom isn't here. Maybe she's at the hospital." When I responded, it seemed like my father realized something and began to speak in a roundabout way. "Ah, I see, that's right. I just got home a little while ago. I think she'll be back soon. Elaine, are you eating properly?" "Yeah, Mom bought some instant noodles for me, so I'm okay." After my reply, there was a brief silence from my father before he changed the subject with a simple "I see." After the conversation with my dad, I heard the front door open, signaling my mom's return. Dad had asked to speak with Mom, so I handed the phone to her when she got home. Mom seemed a bit shaken as she took the phone and talked with Dad. When Mom came home, I could smell tobacco on her, making me wonder where she had been before returning to her room. The next day, when I asked Mom if we could go to the hospital together, she made a complex expression but eventually agreed to take me. The reunion with my father had been a long time coming. He was connected to an IV, but as soon as he saw me, he showed a big smile. "Elaine, I'm so glad you came." I instinctively hugged my father, nearly crying at the sight of him looking so energetic, but I felt very happy. After enjoying a conversation with my father, I left the hospital room as it was time for my mother to return. As I looked back, my father was waving his hand with a smile, saying, "Come visit again." Little did I know that this would be our last conversation. Soon after, my father's condition suddenly worsened, and he passed away. I couldn't believe the reality and dressed in black as my mother instructed, attending the funeral. Many people gathered at the funeral to say their goodbyes to my father. My mother was composed throughout, and watching her, I almost hallucinated that my father was still alive. As I was standing absently in a corner of the venue, someone approached me. "Hey, aren't you Elaine?" Turning around, I saw a woman dressed rather flamboyantly standing there. Confused about who she was, the woman sat next to me and began to speak. "It's been a long time, hasn't it? I'm your aunt, your father's sister." Now that she mentioned it, I could see the resemblance to my father. I didn't know about my aunt, but I had heard my father mention his sister. "Aunt." "Yes, Aunt?" "Don't you think I look like your father?" she said with a laugh, and her face was indeed very much like my father's. At that moment, my aunt suddenly hugged me tightly. "It's okay to cry, Elaine. You've done well," she said, and without realizing it, my tears began to flow even more. It felt like I truly accepted the reality that I would never see my father again at that moment. After my aunt gently stroked my back and I calmed down a bit, I thanked her and then went to get a drink. In the room, I found my mother, who coldly remarked upon seeing my tear-streaked face. "Were you crying? How disgraceful." Her cold words pierced my heart. "Mom, aren't you sad?" I asked, shocked that she seemed not to be grieving at all. "Being sad won't change anything. He's gone now," my mother answered coldly. Her cold words made my body start to tremble. Even though the three of us had always laughed and had fun when my father was around, I wondered if my mother had truly hated him. As I stood frozen, my aunt appeared. "Oh, sister-in-law, long time no see," my aunt said cheerfully, but my mother's expression immediately changed. "Oh, it's been a while." "Do you need any help?" my aunt asked, to which my mother replied, "No, there's nothing." Well then, Elaine, let's go over there," my aunt suggested. She took my hand and we left the room. I could tell from my mother's expression that she felt uncomfortable around my aunt. Afterward, I spent time by my aunt's side, and the funeral ended without incident. "Elaine, we're leaving now," my mother called me after the funeral. My aunt had held my hand throughout the funeral, but she let go when it was time to leave. Her expression was a bit sad. "Elaine, see you again." "Yeah, see you," I replied. As I followed my mother outside, an unfamiliar car was parked there. "Sorry to keep you waiting," my mother said as she opened the car door. An unfamiliar man was in the driver's seat, and I felt a resistance to getting into the car unconsciously. "Don't dawdle, get in quickly," my mother urged in a tone I had never heard from her before. Reluctantly, I got into the car, and it started driving in the opposite direction of our home. I continued to stare out the window. Not knowing where we were going, I felt a slight fear inside the car. "We're here. Get out quickly," I was told as I got out of the car, and there stood a large building, a place completely unfamiliar to me. "Mom, where are we?" I asked as my mother lit a cigarette. "Children are a nuisance, so go to a facility." Stunned, I could only utter a confused "A" as my mother and the man drove away in the car. I desperately chased after the car, but eventually tripped and failed to catch up, forcing me to give up the pursuit. As I was heading back to where I had been left, a car pulled up beside me. The window rolled down and my aunt was sitting in the driver's seat. I never expected things to turn out like this. "Elaine, come on, get in." Relieved to see my aunt again, I quickly got into the car. She patted my head, and in response to her kindness, tears quietly started to flow. "How many times will you cry today? Poor thing." After driving for a while, we arrived at a house which seemed to be my aunt's home. As we entered, a man's voice greeted us warmly with "Welcome back." I instinctively hid behind my aunt, but she laughed and reassured me, "It's okay." As I timidly looked at the person, a young man stood there, smiling warmly at me. "Surprised? Sorry about that. Actually, I'm this lady's husband. So, you can call me Uncle." He extended his hand with a friendly smile. Feeling reassured, I shook his hand, and he smiled again. "You must be hungry, right? Dinner is ready. You need to eat well and grow strong. You're as fussy as a mother." Their light-hearted banter made me laugh, and just then, my stomach growled. I blushed with embarrassment, and they both laughed even more. I was relieved to finally enjoy a fun dinner time, which I had missed for so long. After dinner, a bath was prepared, and pajamas were laid out for me to change into. When I went to the living room, my aunt had prepared some warm milk. "Hot milk, huh? Aren't you a bit too old for that? Right, Elaine?" But don't elementary school kids like hot milk? No? Their playful exchange was so comforting that I couldn't help but laugh along. Led by their laughter, they both began to laugh. "Sit down, I have something to talk about," my uncle said, and as I sat in front of the hot milk, he started speaking. "Hey Elaine, how about becoming our child?" he suddenly proposed, and since I was about to drink my milk, I choked. Cough, cough. "What?" I exclaimed in surprise. Sorry. That was sudden, wasn't it?" my uncle said as he patted my back. My aunt, watching this, laughed heartily. "Why don't you become our child? Do you really want to go back to your mother?" my aunt continued. Her words made me think deeply. I don't hate my mother, but considering the home situation, my father, and being left behind, the thought of returning to her is frightening. "Actually, we had talked to your father about this," my uncle revealed. "What?" Hearing my father's name, I was even more surprised. Then my aunt explained everything in detail. The man my mother was with was her affair partner, and my father knew about the affair. He was very worried about me. As his condition worsened, and he realized he might not have much time left, my father asked them to take care of me after he was gone. Hearing this, tears overflowed and I desperately missed my father. "Your father loved you very much and cared deeply for you," my aunt said as she gently stroked me, her touch warm and comforting. I silently shouted words of thanks to my father over and over in my mind. I remembered my father, who always played with me and whom I dearly loved. I decided that from now on, I want to become stronger. "I want to stay with you, Aunt and Uncle," I told them, and they were very pleased. Formal procedures are needed for us to officially become a family, and while these will take some time to complete, I was assured that I can stay with them without worry in the meantime. Wanting to be useful for my aunt and uncle, I decided to help with preparing breakfast and dinner and cleaning the bathroom and toilet. But my hard work only seemed to worry my aunt and uncle more. Elementary school kids should be playing more, they said, and though I was confused, I started my homework anyway. "Elaine, have you been doing housework all this time?" my aunt asked me at dinner. When I nodded, my uncle sitting next to me gently hugged me and said, "It must have been tough being just a grade schooler. Elementary school students can help out with chores, but I'm worried it looks like you're overdoing it." Indeed, I might have been excessively trying to earn my mother's praise without even realizing it. I fell silent, realizing this. The praise from my mother that I never received. I felt that my efforts might have meant little to her. "You don't need to worry about anything here. You can help out, but what's important is your friends, school, and taking care of yourself. We want you to cherish yourself." My aunt's words resonated deeply with me. My uncle nodded repeatedly, his eyes moist. I strongly felt how happy I was to be with my aunt and uncle. 2 weeks after my father's funeral, I was called to the teacher's room at school. Wondering what it was about, I was told that there was a phone call from my mother. The teacher shouldn't know much about my situation. Thinking that leaving the phone call unattended might trouble the teachers, I picked up the receiver with trembling hands. "Hello." "Elaine. Answer the phone quickly." The voice of my mother, which I hadn't heard in a long time, was shouting. "Where are you right now?" "I called the facility, and they said you aren't there." I choked up, unable to respond. "Are you listening to me? Well, never mind. I'm coming to pick you up because then I'll get the allowance. I need the money right now," my mother said. Hearing her words, I felt myself rapidly regaining composure. The thought of wanting to be loved or praised by someone who had betrayed my father was both frustrating and painful. Now I have my aunt and uncle by my side, and they are precious to me. My beloved father is also watching over me from somewhere. I can become stronger. I don't have a mother anymore. Before I realized it, those words had been directed at my mother. "What? What are you talking about?" my mother retorted. "Are you mistaken? Then, goodbye." Wait a minute before my mother could finish. I had hung up the phone. The teacher present was shocked and asked, "Was that really not your mother?" To which I responded, "That was a stranger." The call was treated as suspicious, and the school issued a caution. Worried that my mother might show up when I was leaving school, I used the school's public phone to contact my aunt. My aunt promised to come and pick me up right away and indeed showed up shortly thereafter. She explained the situation to the school teachers, who decided to contact Child Protective Services. After I got home, my mother did actually come to pick me up, but the teachers handled it, and she left in a bad mood. Although my mother didn't intrude on the school again, considering my safety, my aunt or uncle started picking me up when school ended. While I was grateful for my aunt and uncle's comfort, they encouraged me cheerfully not to worry. With the support of my aunt and uncle, I have been able to lead a happy life. The teachers at school are kind, and I feel supported by many people. One day, the home phone rang. Lately, I have been answering more calls at my aunt's house. As usual, I answered the phone cheerfully with "hello." However, the reply was a voice I did not want to hear. "Oh, isn't this Elaine? I thought you weren't at the facility, but you are there after all." As soon as I heard my mother's voice, I was startled. How did she know I was here? I hadn't told anyone. "Stop staying there and come back soon. Things are tough over here," my mother continued unilaterally. According to my mother, her affair partner's company had gone bankrupt, and she was financially in trouble. Despite hearing my mother's intentions, all I could perceive was her financial dependency on me, which became clear as she continued to plead over the phone. Previously, when she had called the school, she had voiced financial problems, indicating her dire economic situation. As I remained silent, my mother's anger escalated. Amidst her shouting, suddenly my aunt took the phone from me. I turned around to see her smiling, but her expression quickly turned to anger. "Just respond at least." "Are you even listening?" my mother yelled. "It's enough. I can hear you," my aunt responded firmly. My mother's voice trailed off over the phone. My heart was pounding during the confrontation. "How can you not be ashamed? Telling your daughter to come back for money, that's no joke. What do you think Elaine is?" my aunt confronted her. "It's none of your business. Elaine is my daughter. Give her back," my mother argued. "Why did you leave your daughter in front of a facility then?" "Stop making convenient arguments," my aunt retorted. "I'll call the police. I'll accuse you of kidnapping," my mother threatened. "Go ahead, say that. We have evidence of all the terrible things you've done to Elaine. We can share that too. We actually welcome the police. It would resolve things faster," my aunt said assertively. What my mother screamed, and I felt guilty, as if I was causing more trouble. At that moment, unnoticed by me, my uncle had returned and gently patted my shoulder. "It's okay. Leave it to us. This is a matter for adults to resolve." My uncle then took my hand and prepared more hot milk for me. "Elaine, you like hot milk, right? You drink it a lot." "Yes, it was so delicious the first time I tried it. I just loved it, I replied. Hearing this, my uncle smiled happily. After a while, my aunt came back into the living room and noticed my worried look, tousling my hair as she spoke. "What's with that face?" "There's nothing to worry about. We won't let her win." As I fixed my hair, I expressed my gratitude to them. Later, I helped with the dinner preparations. Living with my aunt and uncle made me realize how enjoyable housework could be. A few days later, another call came from my mother. My aunt and uncle had said there was no need to answer her calls anymore, but I wanted to be useful to them. "Elaine? Mom is really in trouble. Help me. I've said this before, but I don't have a mother anymore." "How can you be so cold? I raised you. Have you forgotten the fun days with Dad?" The moment my mother mentioned Dad, my heart skipped a beat, but anger surged within me. "Yes, it was really fun when Dad was around, but only he was kind. You abandoned me." I shouted louder than I expected, feeling a clear sense of relief as I expressed my feelings. After that, I confidently countered her words. "You are still my child, aren't you? I didn't abandon you. I just left you temporarily. You laughed and told me that children are a nuisance and to go to a facility. I can't think of someone like that as my mother." That was. I was forced to say that. It's not my fault. But you abandoned me. Therefore, I have no mother. If I have a mother, it's my aunt. My father is my uncle and my dad in heaven. You're brainwashed. Just come back without complaining. At that moment, I was arguing intensely with my mother while shedding tears. However, strangely, my heart felt lighter, as if I had released everything I had been holding back. Then at least tell them to let me live in their house. I can't even eat properly as it is. No, I won't let you disturb my loved ones. Suddenly, I felt a presence behind me and turned around to find my aunt and uncle standing there. My aunt patted my shoulder and praised me, saying, "Well done." My uncle, with tears in his eyes, nodded in agreement. Then, my aunt took over the phone and continued talking to my mother. Strangely, she seemed satisfied. My uncle expressed how happy he was that I called him Dad. Receiving his words of gratitude made me feel good about calling him that, and it seemed right to continue. After that, the contacts from my mother ceased. Perhaps it was also thanks to my aunt and uncle's support. Sometime after starting my new life, my aunt surprised me with my first smartphone. Having a smartphone for the first time was exciting, and it helped me stay in touch more frequently with friends, making my life even more enjoyable. One unusual day, amid the long, peaceful days, the house's landline rang. Since the situation with my mother, the school had been mostly contacting my aunt and uncle on their mobile phones, and I usually communicated with my friends through my new smartphone. Wondering who it could be, I answered the phone. "Hello." Contrary to my upbeat voice, a lethargic voice responded. Hello, it's me." At first, I didn't recognize who it was, thinking it might be a wrong number. Having been taught not to talk to strangers over the phone at school, I was about to hang up. "Wait, it's Mom. Have you forgotten my voice? Eh? Ah, now that you mention it." When she pointed out it was her, I listened more closely, and indeed, it was my mother's voice. It was noticeably weaker than before, making it initially hard to recognize. "You're going to be in 6th grade soon, huh?" There's no one here now." My mother started to cry at those words. As I was wondering what to do next, she spoke in a heavy tone. "The thing is, I'm in the hospital. I've gotten sick." I thought of my father, but without sadness instead. I felt grateful for all the good memories he had given me. As my mother pleaded for help with her medical expenses and care, I fell silent. "Say something. Why should I take care of a stranger like you?" I won't pay your hospital bills, and I won't ask my aunt to either." "Don't get too cocky." Her vigor was surprising for someone who claimed to be ill. Hearing about my mother's illness did not disturb me as it had when my father passed away. My feelings toward her had completely cooled off, and her words no longer instilled fear in me. I simply felt pity for her situation. I never imagined I could respond to my mother with such detachment, but I knew I never wanted to become like her when I grew up. Actually, I've received a new smartphone, and the home landline is hardly used, so it's going to be removed soon. This might really be our final goodbye. Watching her panic, I continued coldly. "Don't end things this way. Then, give me your smartphone number." "I cannot do that." "Isn't there anyone who will help me?" "There's no one to support me." "Then I'll make sure to contact someone who might look after you." Her voice briefly brightened at my words, but I sighed inwardly. Before hanging up, I obtained the name of the hospital and immediately contacted my aunt. When I reported this interaction to my aunt, she praised me for handling the situation on my own. "Can I ask you to handle any further contact?" I asked. My aunt readily agreed and promised to reach out to someone who could handle the situation. A few days later, I noticed the home phone ringing continuously. Assuming it was likely my mother, I deliberately chose not to answer. That night, the home phone kept ringing late into the evening, continuing even after my aunt and uncle returned home. When I informed my aunt that the phone was still ringing, she sighed and picked up the receiver. As expected, it was my mother on the other end, and a heated exchange began between her and my aunt. My mother persistently demanded to speak with me, but my aunt firmly refused. From the other end of the line, it was clear that my mother was infuriated that I had contacted her brother. Indeed, the person I had asked my aunt to contact was my mother's brother, my uncle, whom I remembered my mother disliked. My mother's brother is known for his stubbornness and deep sense of morality, and he would never tolerate my mother's misconduct. Upon hearing from my aunt, he was furious and promised to come immediately. The reunion between the siblings after several years ended disastrously, fueling my mother's anger towards us. Usually calm, my uncle prompted my aunt to hand him the phone when he saw the situation escalating. However, his expression sternly changed as soon as he took the call. "He gets even scarier than me when he's angry," my aunt whispered to me. "Oh, enough. If you want to talk that much, I'll come myself. I'll make you apologize in front of Elaine. Sick or not, it doesn't matter. Be prepared," my uncle shouted. After my uncle's outburst, my mother hung up in shock. "Oops," she hung up. After the call ended, my uncle was smiling as usual. It seems true that when a generally calm person gets angry, it is indeed frightening. Subsequently, my mother was forcibly taken to her brother's home. Her illness turned out to be milder than expected, and she was soon discharged from the hospital. Forced to live and work on her brother's farm, my mother, who had initially planned a lavish lifestyle with her lover, disliked farm work but had no choice but to toil under her brother's stern demands. Without the luxury to afford expensive brands anymore, She began wearing second-hand clothes donated by villagers. Meanwhile, the adoption process with my aunt and uncle was finalized, and I officially became their child. We celebrated with a big party where I laughed heartily. Surprisingly, we learned that next year, a new brother or sister would join our family, which made me incredibly happy and grateful. This experience reaffirmed my desire to cherish what it means to be